Hello everyone and welcome back to the Winning Agenda's Hero Spotlight series. My name is Jesse Marshall and I'm very excited to be here today with Lexi Livewire, another Ranger hero. We've already done Azalea. Unfortunately for Azalea, as we discussed in that video, not the most competitively viable and probably has dropped off a little bit more even than where it was in the last little while. But Lexi, on the other hand, the second Ranger that we've seen from the Ranger class in Flesh and Blood, turns out to be extremely competitively viable. It's got a much broader card pool, as we'll discuss, with all the new cards from Tales of Aria that are Elemental Ranger. And it's just really got some interesting ways to play with the Ranger mechanics. So let's dive straight in. So Lexi's hero ability is similar to Azalea's in some ways, in that it deals with face-down cards in your arsenal. But rather than allowing you to gain Dominate on an arrow like Azalea by putting a face-down card on the bottom of your deck, what Lexi does is gives you a small advantage for flipping a face-down card in your arsenal face up. Now, there's a few important things about this. One is that it gives you a lot more control over what you're getting out of your hero ability, because you control what goes into your arsenal. I mean, you don't necessarily control what you draw, but from the cards that you have in hand on your any previous turn, you control the one that goes into your arsenal. So that means that if you do put a lightning or ice card to get one of the two benefits, either go again if it's a lightning card that you flip face up, or a frostbite token if it's an ice card that you flip face up, you have a little bit more control over which of those you get and whether they're relevant to the state of the game as it is. Now, obviously, as you construct your deck, the more ice cards you have, or the more lightning cards you have, the more often you're going to be able to trigger Lexi's ability. But the other really interesting thing about Lexi's ability, the once per turn action part of it, is that the fusion mechanic synergizes really nicely with it. So arrows, which we'll come to in a moment, that are Elemental Ranger, all have this mechanic called fusion, which is that you can reveal an ice or lightning card as you play the arrow, as you attack with it, in order to give it a buff of some kind. Now, if you play a fusion arrow and you buff it by fusing with a card from your hand, it's possible that that card's going to be left in your hand at the end of the turn. And therefore, you're going to arsenal it most of the time. And Lexi rewards you for having ice and lightning cards left in your hand at the end of the turn, and therefore arsenaling them. And ice and lightning cards are the same cards that you're going to be fusing with. So there's a natural inherent synergy between Lexi's hero ability and the fusion ability, which is on all of the elemental arrows that you might choose to play. For those of you who aren't familiar with what a frostbite token is, I've got it up there on the screen. It basically imposes attacks on your opponent's next turn for the first thing that they want to play, or the first ability that they want to activate, or even in your turn. So as soon as they take the frostbite, the next thing that they do, whether it's in the rest of your turn or in their next turn, is going to cost them one additional resource. Once they've paid that tax, the frostbite goes away, or at the end of the next turn it goes away. Frostbites also stack, so you'll see as we go through that there are multiple ice cards in particular, or ice fusion cards, that give frostbite tokens. And if you can give multiple frostbite tokens to your opponent, then the next thing that they do is going to cost multiple more resources, which can be quite backbreaking for a number of decks that try to run quite low curves. So Lexi, like Azalea, had two bows to choose from, Death Dealer and Redliner, but Lexi's actually got a series of additional bows that she can choose from. So the first one is the majestic Voltaire Strike Twice. It's a twice per turn instant, importantly, so you can actually, every turn, be attacking with two arrows, not really having to work any harder to do that. Which means, unlike Azalea, you can fill your deck with a lot more arrows rather than pump cards, and go wide and go tall. Because you can give a buff with Voltaire as a reward for loading the arrow. You either get +1 or go again. So your first arrow on the turn, if it's one that doesn't already have go again, you can give it go again, and then the second arrow for the turn that you load in, you can give +1. So you've got the ability to go wide and then to make your second or your final attack on any turn that you load in with Voltaire a little bit more powerful. Unlike Death Dealer, you don't get the card back for the resource that you spend to load the bow. But because it's a twice per turn, because it's an instant, so it has a little bit more flexibility, you can do it on your opponent's turn, you can do it in your turn, and you don't have to break the combat chain, crucially, because there are a lot of cards like Ball Lightning, which we'll come to later, and just a lot of cards in Fab in general that give buffs for the duration of a combat chain. And Death Dealer and Redliner both are actions, meaning that when you use them to load your arrow, you're breaking the combat chain. So in order to keep some synergy with some of those cards that buff for the duration of the combat chain, you can utilize Voltaire's ability being an instant. And like Voltaire, or not like Voltaire, Death Dealer, as we've described, doesn't have that ability. I was going to say Shiver, which is the other new bow, is also an instant. It's a once per turn instant, and it's got Dominate instead of Go Again. So this is really for those builds with Lexi that do want to play heaps of buffs and have one really powerful attack on their turn, and they want to be dominating it consistently. You can have the ability to do that with Shiver. Now, obviously, there is a downside to including a lower density of arrows and a higher density of pumps in a ranger deck. Because your weapon doesn't attack on its own, if you do draw one of those dreaded 4 pump hands, you actually can't do anything on your turn whatsoever. So that Shiver strategy of one big attack per turn with lots more pumps and fewer arrows is fraught with that little bit of danger, but certainly against some heroes, being able to dominate big attacks with powerful on-hit abilities can be really good. But you do see Voltaire seeing quite a lot more play at a competitive level than Shiver for that reason, because it doesn't demand that you play so many pumps to get powerful turns, because you can attack with 2 arrows very easily. Death Dealer does actually have an interesting combo in Tales of Aria with a card called Snapshot, which we'll come to later, which gives you the ability to reuse your Death Dealer over and over again, so long as you can keep fusing your snapshots. And because it allows you to use Death Dealer as an instant, it lets you regain the action point. Because Death Dealer's ability is an action with Go Again, Snapshot allows you to use Death Dealer's ability again as an instant, so it doesn't cost you the action point to activate Death Dealer, but you still get the action point from the Go Again ability. So you actually net an action point back. So even if your Snapshot that you're attacking with doesn't have Go Again, if it's fused, it allows you to use the Death Dealer again, which then gives you an action point back that you can play the next Snapshot, and so on and so on and so on. Which in combination with things like 3 of a Kind can give you quite wide turns, and it is a different dimension to Death Dealer than what we've seen before. Obviously, you're also drawing a card each time you activate the Death Dealer, further fueling your capacity to have really wide turns with snapshots. So some of the key equipment that's come out in Tales of Aria that synergizes really well with Voltaire is New Horizon, firstly. So this is the famous double Arsenal card, the first card that allows you to have 2 cards in Arsenal in Flesh and Blood, which means that you can, of course, have 6 card hands quite easily. So while you have a face-up card in your Arsenal, you have an additional Arsenal zone. When New Horizon is destroyed, destroy all cards in your Arsenal. And it's got Blade Break and 2 block, meaning that at some stage in the late game, when you really need that 2 block to stay alive, you can give up your second Arsenal slot to just keep the game going, which is kind of cool. But so long as you do have New Horizon on the board, if you've got 1 face-up card in your Arsenal, you have an additional Arsenal zone. So what that means is it's actually really important in play patterns with Voltaire. It's also worth mentioning that it doesn't synergize at all with Death Dealer. So in the Death Dealer builds, you're not going to want to play New Horizon because Death Dealer specifically says if you have no cards in your arsenal, you can load an arrow, whereas Voltaire and Shiver both say you can load an arrow into an empty arsenal slot. So if you've used Lexi's ability, for example, you had an Ice or Lightning card in your arsenal at the end of your last turn. At the start of your turn, you use Lexi's action to flip it face up, giving them a Frostbite or getting Go Again. You then, with New Horizon, activate your second Arsenal slot into which you can load the arrows. And that just gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of which Ice and Lightning cards you play and which cards you have in your arsenal. It also gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of which cards you arsenal from turn to turn, because you can do things like Arsenal an arrow, flip the arrow face up with Lexi's ability, not getting any bonus, but you then still activate your second Arsenal slot, meaning you can use Voltaire, load a new arrow with Go Again, attack, load another new arrow with Go Again from your hand, attack, and then use the arrow that you had arsenaled last turn for a 3 attack turn. And that's something that's made possible by New Horizon, and it gets rid of some of that clogging your arsenal issue that did happen with Azalea from time to time. Shock Charmers is the second new equipment that is kind of key. Heart of Ice as well, I'll come to later. It's a little bit less key in terms of game plan, and it's more about defensive disruption. But Shock Charmers gives you this really interesting ability to pay 2 resources as an instant, which means you can do it in the defense reactions window. And it gives you this ability, the next time an attack action card you control hits a hero this turn, it deals 1 damage to them. And when we come to a lot of the elemental arrows, what you'll see is they don't just have abilities that say when this attack hits, they have abilities that say when this attack or whenever an attack deals damage this turn. And that means that if you use Shock Charmers, the attack that you're using the Shock Charmers for will deal an additional instance of damage as a separate instance, which means it'll trigger all those whenever an attack deals damage this turn triggers again. I'll explain that again once we've got the other cards up on the screen. But it basically allows you to get some additional frostbites or some additional disruption or damage triggers off your lightning arrows. The other interesting thing about Shock Charmers, which I'll mention, is that it is a resource sink that you can use at any time as an instant, which means that if you have a 3 of a kind turn, you can use it obviously to buff your arrows if they're going to hit, but even if they don't hit, you can still cycle your hand at the end of the turn just by pitching to activate Shock Charmers. And that means you can get unwanted cards out of hand or pitch stack or get things on the bottom of your deck to try and make sure you don't get stuck with the wrong cards in hand, which can be quite useful. It doesn't come up that often, but it is useful still to have that ability. So obviously integral to Lexi's gameplay is this question of the elemental cards. So Pulse of Volthaven is the dual element card. It's a legendary, so you can only have one in your deck. It's not a legendary rarity. It's a legendary card, meaning that it's only one per deck. It's the mechanic. Your next lightning, ice, or elemental attack this turn gains +4. So it's a 0 that buffs for 4, which is, above rate for most things. In terms of buffs, it's also an instant, meaning that it doesn't break the combat chain. And it pitches for 1. But crucially, being a lightning ice card, the dual element card gives you just this additional bonus in Lexi, meaning that you can arsenal it, flip it face up, get both a go again on your next attack and a frostbite to your opponent. Then you can either play it or you can keep it in your arsenal for your second attack if you've got New Horizon. Load in an arrow with go again from your Lexi ability, attack them, and then at any point you can play this Pulse of Volthaven into the turn to buff the attack that is most important to buff. And that's an extremely powerful play pattern. So it's your Pulse of Volthaven turn is always a really good turn if you can get it into the arsenal, which usually you can because you're not going to be blocking with it because it doesn't block. Ice Quake is an example of an ice card, and then Lightning Press is an example of a lightning card. So you can see it down the bottom, Ice Action, Lightning Instant. Ice Quake is an archetypal example of the ice mechanics, and that is just giving frostbites to your opponent on a hit. So it gives a buff, it costs 1, buffs for 3, and it says whenever an attack hits a hero this turn, create a frostbite token under their control. So obviously a lot of synergy there with Lexi's ability to throw multiple arrows at the opponent, meaning that if they don't block, they're both taking the arrow hit, the damage, they're taking the arrow on hit trigger, which most of them have, and they're getting frostbites each time they get hit. So they are incentivized to block, which means that Lexi can keep up a bit of that tempo using cards like Ice Quake. Lightning Press and the Lightning cards, on the other hand, let you do things that are more tricky at instant speed, or just they're basically kind of how can we force through max damage. So Lightning Press is a great one because it is at the intersection of those two things. So it's giving you the instant speed ability to just cut in with damage unexpectedly, and it's forcing through 3 damage for 0 resources, which is really on rate what you want for your tricks. So a great card, Lightning Press, doesn't block, is the downside obviously, but very good at getting you those on-hit triggers at instant speed, and a good example of what the lightning cards can bring to the card pool. So in terms of the arrows, so these are the bread and butter of your Lexi decks. You've got the ice arrows, which we're going to look at here, and then the lightning arrows, and then of course you've got all the neutral ranger arrows, which you can play as well. So all the existing ranger, the green cards that Azalea was able to play, Lexi can also play them, except for, of course, the Azalea specialization, red in the ledger, and knock the death whistle as well, the other Azalea specialization. But all the other ranger cards are available to Lexi. So Frostlock is the first ice arrow, and this is a really powerful one in the metagame at the moment because there are a lot of decks that are utilizing 0-cost cards and trying to run really low curves. Briar's a great example. A lot of people saying, Briar's an incredibly strong deck. Some people saying it deserves to be banned or have some kind of intervention from LSS. Well, Frostlock's a really great example of a card that lets you interact very favorably with those Briar decks and force them to block. So what it is a 1-cost arrow for 3. It's a blue, so that's pretty much on rate for a blue arrow. It's got Ice Fusion, meaning that as an additional cost to play it, you can reveal an ice card from your hand. Cards and activated abilities cost opposing heroes an additional 1 resource this turn, meaning that defense reactions are more expensive. So if they want to sink below this, they have to actually pay 1 for it, which can invalidate any 0-cost defense reactions in their hand, basically, and make them extremely inefficient. If Frostlock was fused, so if you've done that Ice Fusion, it gains +1 strength, and if it hits a hero, until the end of their next turn, they can't pitch or play cards with base cost 0. So any 0-cost attacks, they can't play them, and they can't pitch them for any other effect. So they can actually be left with cards that they can't do anything with in their hand on their next turn if this hits. So it's an extremely powerful on-hit trigger. If you can play this with a Voltaire, get it in, fuse it, give it go again, and if you've got something like a Lightning Press, then you can force the on-hit. You can make it really difficult for them to block, and you can add effectively attack reaction damage from the Lightning Press instant, or you can look to do something more like buffing it in advance with things like Ice Quake or Weave Ice. And Weave Ice is a really powerful one because it will actually give this Dominate. So if you Weave Ice, play this, load it up, play it, fuse it, you can actually give this Dominate and make it really hard for them to block, meaning that, as I said, if you are playing against one of those Briar decks, or even another Lexi deck that's a Lightning Lexi that's playing a lot of 0-cost arrows, this can hose them pretty hard and can be pretty good. So Frostlock's a really powerful part of the Ice arsenal. Blizzard Bolt and Chilling Icevein are the next 2. So they both have their reds that attack for 5, the yellows are 4, and the blues are 3. These are kind of the core of the Ice Arrow card pool. Blizzard Bolt says whenever an attack deals damage to a hero this turn, so that's that callback to Shock Charmers. It's not just on hit, it's any instance of damage that they deal. So Shock Charmers extra pings count separately. Create a Frostbite token under that hero's control. So you're giving your opponent Frostbites when you hit, but also those additional Shock Charmers pings are giving them additional Frostbites. And it doesn't just apply to Blizzard Bolt itself, it applies to any other attack this turn. So not just arrows, also non-arrow attacks. And same with Chilling Icevein. If Chilling Icevein was fused, whenever an attack deals damage to a hero this turn, they discard a card unless they pay 1. Again, synergizes with Shock Charmers, but also synergizes with non-arrow attacks. And because you've got the built-in Go Again from Voltaire, you can easily load one of these arrows, attack with it, fuse it, and then follow up with another attack. Like, that's not really hard to set up, but it is something quite powerful that your opponent has to respect, either blocking or making sure they've got enough resources to cover the tax that you're placing on them. And that's really the core of this Ice Lexi build and where it fits into the Flesh and Blood metagame. It's putting out reasonable amounts of damage. It can go reasonably wide. It can pump with things like, go reasonably wide with Voltaire. It can pump with things like Weave Ice and Ice Quake and other pumps. You can still play some of the lightning cards like Lightning Press to have some combat tricks and get over the top. But you're also presenting some disruption. So it's not just about raw damage output. It's also disrupting your opponent and presenting them with the inability to simply say, I'll just take all your damage and come back at you with everything I've got, because they have to pay resources, for instance, for your Chilling Icevein if they choose to take all the damage, or they have to pay additional resources to play their things next turn if they take damage from your Blizzard Bolts, and so on. Or with Frostlock, they simply can't play their cards if they take the damage. Cold Wave is a really good one as an alternate to that. So Blizzard Bolt, Chilling Icevein, Frostlock, they all hose the decks that don't want to block, the decks that are full of 0 costs, the decks that are low curve. Cold Wave gives the Ice decks a sideboard option to hose the decks that go the other direction, that just want to play heaps of defense reactions and try and fatigue you out. So Cold Wave has a similar ability to Frostlock. It says, if it's fused, cards and activated abilities cost opposing heroes an additional resource this turn. Which means that if you're playing against an Oldhim, or even a Bravo, or someone else who's playing heaps of defense reactions, their defense reactions are going to cost them additional resources each time. So even Oldhim's defense reaction ability, the hero ability, will cost an additional resource. Sink Belows will cost 1. Fate for Scenes will cost 1. And if you combo them with Heart of Ice, which is one of the chess pieces of equipment, the ice chess piece, then you can make them cost 2 more that turn. So Cold Wave applies not only to its chain link, but to the whole turn again. So it gives you that ability to make their defense reactions less efficient. So Blizzard Bolt and Chilling Icevein make their next turn less efficient if they're one of those aggro decks that is coming back at you. Cold Wave and Frostlock's first ability, this additional tax on your turn, makes defensive decks less efficient. So you've got the ability to make attacking and aggressive and defensive decks both less efficient against you, which is kind of cool from this Ice Arrow card pool. Lightning Arrows, on the other hand, are all about raw damage output. So they're all about, I'm going to hit you, and I'm going to keep hitting you, and I'm going to keep hitting you, and the amount of damage that I'm dealing you is going to be more, hopefully, than what you can put out from your cards on your turn if you choose to just tank it all. So Light It Up has a really powerful on-hit ability if it's fused. So it's a 1-for-4, which is standard yellow arrow ratio. If it hits a hero, it deals 1 damage to them for each equipment they control. And if it deals damage to them equal to or greater than the number of equipment they control lose and can't gain activated abilities till the end of their next turn. So they still accumulate Tunic counters, but they can't use the Tunic's activated ability, for example. They can't make Rune Chants with their Grasp of the Arknight. They can't use Arcane Barrier, not that that really matters against you. But yeah, they can't use activated abilities, basically, on their equipment. They can't use Heart of Ice. The damage that this does, though, is where it really shines. So if you're loading this in with a Voltaire, giving it +1, attacking, fusing, and then they've got 4 equipment, it's 5 base, plus if it hits, another 4. Like, that's an incredible amount of damage for 1 resource that you're putting into attacking with it. Obviously, you have to pay 1 to load, so even if you say 2, a 2 for 9 is well above rate and is a great threat to be presenting. And given you've got things like Lightning Press in the card pool that can let you get over the top and ensure that it hits, you're giving yourself the ability to do quite a lot of damage. You've also got Ball Lightning, which we've got there in the background of this image, and that is going to buff not only the damage that Light It Up deals, but also the damage from the additional ping that it does of 1, 2, 3, or 4 damage. So as you can see as we go through, the Lightning decks are all about just synergizing together to get over the top and hit, but then deal heaps of damage when they do. So Snapshot and Buzzbolt are 2 other examples. Snapshot I talked about earlier, it's a little bit different. It's more of a combo-oriented card. Or it's still about going wide, but the combo with Death Dealer means that it's just a little bit different to the way that the other Lightning Arrows are playing. But certainly that combo with Death Dealer is something to think about and something to potentially build around because it's very, very powerful. Although, as I said, you do have to give up on New Horizon. So you have to kind of tailor your elemental pool, knowing that you're playing more things like Weave Lightning that you want to play before you play arrows, so you can clear out your arsenal, rather than things like Lightning Press that might get stuck in your arsenal. If you do play Lightning Press, just don't arsenal them because they won't synergize at all with your Snapshot. They'll just clog up your arsenal. Buzzbolt is an example of the aforementioned lightning strategy of just damage and amplification. If it was fused, whenever an attack hits a hero this turn, it deals 1 damage to them. So like Shock Charmers, it's just giving you that extra little ping whenever your attacks hit heroes this turn. Frazzle is the compatriot to Buzzbolt, if you like, and it says if Frazzle was fused, whenever an attack would deal damage this turn, instead it deals that much damage +1. So if you've got a Buzzbolt, you hit them, or you fused it, you hit them, it's going to deal an extra damage from the Buzzbolt's ability. Frazzle is then going to turn that extra 1 ping into 2. And then you've got other lightning cards like Ball Lightning, as I mentioned, that are going to increase those pings even further. So lightning is all about amplification of damage, as well as going wide and giving you the capacity to have go-agains, which is where Snapshot and Dazzling Crescendo fall in. So Dazzling Crescendo, a 0-cost arrow, like Snapshot, and rather than giving you bonuses and more damage, they give you the ability to have more attacks. Now, my personal experience with these arrows is that I haven't found Dazzling Crescendo and Snapshot to be quite as powerful. I've found the 1-cost arrows to be more powerful, just because they are threatening on hit effects, whereas both Snapshot and Dazzling Crescendo give you the ability to attack again, but your opponent isn't really incentivized to block them as much because there's no penalty for them not blocking. Whereas I think the way the metagame is at the moment, certainly, things that are presenting damage amplification and more of a threat of disruption in the ice pool, when they hit, are going to be a little bit more powerful. But still, Dazzling Crescendo is an option there for sure. So other arrows that you can play, as I mentioned, all the existing ranger arrows, such as Remorseless, which we've got the art for there. Bolt and Shot is one of the new Tales of Aria ones, which is can be very powerful, particularly with Voltaire, because what it's a 0-cost arrow, so 0 for 4, which is the usual arrow ratio. While Bolt and Shot's power is greater than its base power, it has Go Again, and if this hits, reload. So that means you can actually load Bolt and Shot with +1 with Voltaire and attack, and the Bolt and Shot will have Go Again because it's got power greater than its base power. So it basically turns Voltaire into +1 and Go Again, which is pretty strong for a 0-cost arrow. It's also got this ability to, in the middle of your three of a kind turns, if you play this as your second arrow, for example, you can load something else, shoot it, like a Chilling Icevein or a Blizzard Bolt, shoot it, fuse it. Then you can load a Bolt and Shot, shoot it, and if they let the Bolt and Shot hit, then you actually get a third arrow attack because you get to reload, meaning that you get around your Voltaire's twice per turn restriction. So Bolt and Shot can play a role in those Voltaire decks on those 3 of a kind turns, but also just as a reasonably efficient arrow. It's worth noting, though, as we'll go through, some of the ice buffs and even the lightning buffs may not affect cards that are not elemental, particularly the ice buffs. So sometimes you won't be able to buff your Bolt and Shot in the way that you might expect with the elemental pool, but of course there's cards like Take Aim and all the existing ranger buffs that will still apply to your Bolt and Shot. Headshot is another example of just an above rate arrow. So it's a 1-cost arrow that if it's put into your arsenal face up, it gains +2. And because Voltaire is putting arrows into arsenal face up, you can actually load this in with Voltaire. It gets +2 for being loaded. You can give it +1 with Voltaire, so then it's actually attacking as a 1 for 7, which is pretty strong. Yes, you've paid the 1 to load it, so it's effectively a 2 for 7, but still, that's, again, above rate. So happy to think about Headshot in some of these builds, with, of course, the downside of you don't want to play too many non-elemental arrows if you're relying on some of those elemental synergies. Endless Arrow, another great one with Voltaire. You load it in with +1, load it in with Go Again, you shoot it. This is off maybe a 2-card hand. You're still threatening 9 power worth of attacks this turn if they let the first one hit, which means that they have to block. So Endless Arrow is an on-hit trigger that with Voltaire can actually threaten quite a bit more damage, because if you go pitch a yellow, load Endless Arrow with Go Again, shoot it, if they let it hit, you get it back in hand, you've got a floating resource, you just load it again with +1, shoot it again. So you've attacked for 9 off 2 cards, which is really, really good, which means that they have to commit some equipment or have a defense reaction for 4 or something else to be able to stop those turns from going off. So Endless Arrow is just a nice little mid-range piece that can give you more efficient 2-card hands. Hamstring Shot is another one that plays a role much like a Frostbite token. It's effectively a Frostbite token, but it doesn't apply to activated abilities. It only applies to attacks. So, in those ice builds, it's a 1 for 5. It's right on rate for arrows. It's another thing that you can add if you're just craving more on hit triggers. Unlike Blizzard Bolt, it doesn't apply to subsequent attacks this turn, so it's a little bit worse. But it is another red. So, for example, if you're playing 3 red Blizzard Bolt, 3 red Chilling Icevein, you might, rather than, some builds you might see have 9 Chilling Icevein, 3 red, 3 yellow, 3 blue, and 9 Blizzard Bolt, 3 red, 3 yellow, 3 blue. You might make the call that Hamstring Shot is actually better than the blue Blizzard Bolts, because rather than being a 1 for 3, maybe you don't need quite so many blues in your deck, you just care about the trigger, the on-hit trigger, so you'd rather play the red Hamstring Shot than the blue Blizzard Bolt, for example. But those are just, different choices that you can make in your deck building, and different advantages that Lexi has from having such a broad card pool. Searing Shot is another one. It's a 0 cost arrow, which can be helpful. It can mean that you can, off 1 blue, load and shoot a 1 cost arrow, and then load and shoot a 0 cost arrow, because that's 3 resources total. And Searing Shot is, the best rate in terms of damage if it hits a 0 for 5 naturally, which then, if you're adding a Voltaire buff on top of that, can be 0 for 6 damage, so not too bad. Remorseless, again, a really, really strong on-hit trigger. So another one that a lot of Lexi decks you'll see playing, because particularly at the moment where there are lots of decks that are trying to go wide in terms of plunder runs and drawing lots of extra cards and playing lots of actions on their turn, the threat of potentially even 1 or 2, but once you get up with Briar decks that are aiming to play, 2 non-attack actions and then at least 2 attack actions, once you get up to 3, 4, even 5 extra damage that you're threatening from Remorseless, it really does incentivize blocks from those decks, and it's just very good against those other aggressive decks. So other attacks that you might play that aren't arrows include Entwine Lightning, which is in the Lightning decks, a 0 for 4 that you can easily fuse and give go again. So it just lets you go a little bit wider on those big turns. Even at the start of a three of a kind turn, you can just go Entwine Lightning, fuse with the Lightning card, and then play a 3 of a kind, and you've already got a 0 cost 4 power attack in, which is pretty strong. Enlightened Strike goes without saying, it's in almost all of the Hero Spotlight videos I've made. It's just a powerful card. It's efficient. It's versatile. Command and Conquer, likewise, very good in the mirror. Not so good in this deck in general, because you don't have so many ways to give it go again. It's still okay though. At the end of the turn, obviously you can give all your arrows go again, so you can do the Command and Conquer last. But it's just a little bit less flexible in this deck than in a Briar deck, for example. But still worth playing. Ice. So these are just some examples of the ice cards that I like to play. So obviously if you're playing those ice arrows, the Chilling Iceveins and the Blizzard Bolts, one of the downsides of the elemental arrows and the fusion mechanic is you actually need to have a critical mass of these ice cards in your deck, otherwise you're not going to have any cards to fuse with. And that obviously then also becomes quite demanding in terms of cards in your hand. You need to start with a pitch card, the arrow that you want to load, or 2 arrows, plus a fusion card. So you're looking at 3 to 4 card hands to be able to pull off big attacks. But when your big attack turns with these ice cards also are going to impact on your opponent's next turn, you can afford to take a bit of damage and then swing back with a 4 or 5 card hand, or even a 6 card hand if you've set it up with New Horizon over the course of a couple of turns, and try and take some tempo and also stop them from being able to both block you and come back at you with anything using your Frostbite tokens. So Polar Blast is a good example of one card that plays well into that. It works really well as part of a 6 card hand. It can, on a previous turn, you can just turn it face up with Lexi, leave it sitting there, and then wait, draw up the next turn, take some damage, and then, use a Tunic counter, play your Polar Blast. You draw a card off the Polar Blast, meaning you've still got 6 cards left, but they've got to pay 3 resources, or if you play blue, they've got to pay 1 resource, because I think the blue is the best version. They've got to pay 1 resource, or your next attack gains Dominate. And obviously, if you're then starting with a 6 card hand, your next attack having Dominate can be really strong. If it's a Chilling Icevein or a Blizzard Bolt, just starting off being able to get that chain going in terms of getting those on-hit triggers happening, as well as being obviously pairing really well with Shock Charmers. Ice Quake is another good ice card. I've already mentioned that, just adding on-hit Frostbites to all the rest of your turn, as well as buffing for 3. But the 1 cost does add up, so do keep that in mind. With Polar Blast, at least it replaces itself with another card, so it's actually going to be resource positive a lot of the time on that particular turn. Whereas Ice Quake, it's a buff, but all your arrows, if you're playing Ice particularly, are tending to cost 1. So you have to be a little bit careful about whether you can actually afford to play this and load all your arrows on your turn. Winter's Grasp is a good sideboard card. It's the only ice card that blocks for 3, so sometimes you'll just main deck it as well. But it's a good sideboard card against Prism because it blocks for 6 as well, the red. Channel Lake Frigid is really like the power card in the ice pool, so all the channel cards are pretty good. Channel Thunderstep less so, but both Channel Mount Heroic and Channel Lake Frigid are really, really strong power cards that can swing tempo and swing games. Channel Lake Frigid is worth playing a few blue ice cards like Polar Blast that I mentioned, and even Weave Ice, which we'll come to in a moment, just so you can have the support package in your deck to be able to sustain your Channel Lake Frigid. And it is really another payoff for including all these ice cards in your deck, along with being able to fuse your arrows. It's the secondary payoff, if you like. And what it says is cards and activated abilities cost opposing heroes an additional resource. And it's got the Channel Ice ability, which means that each turn you need to be pitching more and more ice cards to be able to keep it on the board. But even if you just keep it, if you pitch a blue ice card to play it, on your opponent's next turn, every card and every activated ability they play costs an additional one. So against a Dash deck, a Briar deck, any deck that's trying to go wide with lots of activated abilities and lots of cards is going to really struggle to play through a Channel Lake Frigid. And their turn is going to be, a lot of the time, half as good or even worse. So well worth in those matchups the tempo loss of committing a couple of cards to playing it. And if you can keep it alive for 2 turns in those matchups, you can often find that you've turned the tempo a little bit on the first turn, but then you've really sunk the boot in on the second turn and taken back the tempo fully. So that can be a really cool feeling, and it's definitely a very powerful card. Weave Ice is a buff, as I mentioned, that also can give Dominate. So it's a 0 cost, +3, and if your next attack is fused, it gains Dominate, which really is the core of what allows you to threaten damage, but also just land some of those on-hit triggers. Things like Frostlock. If you can land that on-hit trigger from the Frostlock using Dominate from Weave Ice against a Briar deck, you can pretty much just take their next turn off them sometimes, which can be awesome. Fang is just another little disruptive piece. If you do want another attack in terms of ratios in your ice pool, because obviously, as I mentioned at the very start, one of the problems with Azalea and particularly Go Tall Azalea decks is that if you have to include too many pumps to make your deck's damage output good enough, if you're only generally attacking with 1 arrow, if you draw an all pump hand, it's really bad. Or even if you're playing a few generic attack actions, like some of the Azalea decks will play like Ravenous Rabbles and things, even if you just have one of those but no other arrows, it's still not great. But at least you've got something out of the turn. And Frostfang kind of fulfills that role as an attack that's in your other section, your non-arrow section of your deck, that actually has some utility as well as being able to fuse for you. So you've got this, and you've got Winter's Grasp that I mentioned earlier, that blocks for 3, and pops Prism's Phantasms. And then you've got Icy Encounter, which blocks for 2, but gives a Frostbite on hit. So they're sort of your options in terms of the ice card pool. Lightning cards, as I mentioned, all about damage amplification, all about more attacks. So Ball Lightning, whenever a lightning or elemental action card would deal damage to this combat chain, instead it deals that much +1. So much better synergy, as I mentioned, with Voltaire and with Shiver, given that it refers to combat chain, less so when you're playing a Death Dealer build, and less so when you're playing more generic ranger attacks, because it only buffs lightning or elemental action cards. Heaven's Claws is the vanilla 3 block. There's one of these in each element. Winter's Grasp in Ice, Heaven's Claws in Lightning, and it's perfectly serviceable to just play it as a 3 block lightning card. Electrify is the Polar Blast equivalent. It's the draw card if played from Arsenal. So really good with those Lexi play patterns of using it as a fuser, then arsenaling it, flipping it with Lexi's ability, then playing it out to draw a card back. Works really nicely there, but isn't the most powerful effect. I think I prefer Polar Blast effect sometimes, but can be used in the right deck and can certainly lead to some massive turns. Lightning Press is the combat trick, +3, really powerful card, sees play in Briar and in a lot of Lexi builds, whether Lightning or Ice builds, just because a 0 for +3 is really where you want to be at. It doesn't buff Command and Conquer, keep that in mind. It doesn't buff your 2-cost ice attacks like Frostfang, but it buffs all your arrows. So that cost 1 or less restriction is not too bad. Lightning Surge is, again, just a really powerful lightning card. Works so well with Lexi's ability. More so in a New Horizon build, less so in a Death Dealer build where you don't have the second Arsenal slot. And this is a great example of New Horizon opening up new horizons or new opportunities for you to use those Arsenal cards. So you Arsenal the Lightning Surge, you flip it face up with Lexi, give your next attack go again, And because you've got the second Arsenal slot from New Horizon, you can actually load in an arrow and shoot the arrow, or you can play another attack from hand that doesn't naturally have Go Again, and it gets Go Again from Lexi's ability, and then you can play a Lightning Surge, which has Go Again anyway because it's in Arsenal. So you're not forced to play the Lightning Surge out straight away because you've got New Horizon, which is great. So some other utility plays that you've got available to you. I've mentioned 3 of a Kind quite a few times. It's really good in Lexi. Shock Charmers gives you an outlet for resources and a sink for resources, meaning that if you do end up only being able to play 1 more attack, for example, or even 2 more attacks, and you've got some cards left in hand, you've actually got something to do with them on your turn and with those resources. Lexi also just Voltaire, giving you the ability to get more things into Arsenal, as well as New Horizon giving you the chance to have these 6-card hands where you've got 2 cards sitting in Arsenal, means that you've just got more capacity to play stuff through your Arsenal in your turn, and 3 of a Kind turns just have so much more flexibility. So 3 of a Kind is one of the best cards in any Lexi deck for sure. Poison the Tips is an option. It's both got Reload, which lets you get an additional attack in on those big turns to get around Voltaire's twice per turn ability. But it also, it's worth noting with Reload though, that you have to have no cards in your arsenal. So just like with Death Dealer, it doesn't really synergize with New Horizon and those 6-card hands. But obviously there are lots of times when you can slot this in, at the start or the middle of a turn to make it work. And it says, until end of turn, arrows you control gain. If this hits a hero, they discard a card. So obviously just another great on-hit ability. Being a non-elemental, non-fusion card, there is some question as to how useful it is and whether it does find a place in a lot of these Lexi decks, but certainly worth thinking about including. It's one that I've kind of had on the fringe of a number of different Lexi builds, but never actually got into the deck. But yeah, it's certainly there or thereabouts. And Take Cover similarly. A good defense reaction, gives you that reload ability, but the fact that reload doesn't synergize with New Horizon because you have to have an empty arsenal, just I think counts against these reload cards a little bit and means that they often don't make the cut. In terms of sideboard cards, Sleep Dart is very powerful. If you hit Livewire with this in the mid game, or even if you threaten it, you're just forcing them to block because they can't really afford to have their hero ability invalidated. And there are a lot of other heroes that love to use their hero ability every turn. Decks like Bolton, even decks like Briar, invalidating their hero ability can be quite strong. So definitely worth including some Sleep Darts in your sideboard. Blink can be useful. It's a lightning fusing card, but it also is just a useful way to get action points against Prism if they're playing auras. So worth considering as a sideboard slot if you're expecting lots of Prism. And Blizzard is just really strong against Briar. Just being able to force them to spend 2 resources to keep their turn going can actually cause them a lot of headaches, given their low curve of a lot of the Briar decks. I mean, some, particularly the Earth decks that are playing Channel Mount Heroic, will have blues and will be able to pay this tax. But sometimes they'll have hands where they can't, and you can just Blizzard. But it's also an ice card, so it fuses all your arrows, and it's a blue. So certainly worth thinking about Blizzard in the sideboard in those matchups like Briar or Dash, for example. So some equipment that you can think about using. Skullcap and Tunic we've talked about before. Shock Charm, as I mentioned. Perch Grapplers is just to block 2 boots, which is above rate, and certainly where you want to be. New Horizon, which we've talked about, you're probably going to play in most of the Voltaire builds and most of the Shiva builds, but Skullcap is always an option if you really need it and really want it, or it's particularly important in a matchup, or you're playing Death Dealer and so you don't really want to play New Horizon. Skullcap's always there as the most efficient other headpiece. And then we've got Heart of Ice as a replacement for Tunic in some matchups. Particularly those decks that are going to be either defense reaction heavy, where this activated ability is going to be strong, or decks where we need Arcane Barrier. It hoses Kano really hard, but it's really good against Oldhim as well, good against Bravo, and the ability to make, and Prism as well, the ability to make their activated abilities cost 1 more means that Prism can't, for example, pitch a blue, make a Spectral Shield, and block with the boots, the Phantasmal Footsteps, because even though the Phantasmal Footsteps is not an activated ability, it's a triggered ability, you're making their Prism ability cost 3. So they have to spend their whole blue if they want to make a Spectral Shield, which is a terrible return on investment for them. And they don't then have the resource to block with the boots. So yeah, Heart of Ice has a few utility uses. Very good against Kano, good against Guardian, good against Defense Reaction heavy decks, and pretty good against Prism. If you're looking to play the deck on a budget, you've got a few options. Honing Hood, perfectly reasonable headpiece, gives you a Arsenal swap, if you like, as well as giving you the ability to put something face down and then have Lexi's ability online on your turn, which can give you a key go again or just a useful frostbite at one point in the game. It's also worth noting with Honing Hood, you don't have to have anything in your arsenal to use the ability. Deep Blue is a perfectly fine common, we've talked about before, way to just get a few resources on a key turn by cycling away a red and turning it into a blue. Bullseye Braces, perfectly serviceable as a glove instead of Shock Charmers, and certainly there'll be some Lexi builds that will just play Bullseye Braces main deck instead of Shock Charmers if they're not anticipating using the Charmers very much, particularly the lower to the ground Lightning decks that aren't going to have as many spare resources. Bullseye Braces is just a great thing to have on a key 3 of a kind turn. It just lets you go one wider. And even for the ice decks, turning a 3 of a kind turn into a 3 attack rather than a 2 attack can be really nice. Snapdragon Scalers is just really handy boots to have. Gives you that extra little go again when you need it. And if you haven't got Perch Grapplers, it's a nice little way to extend one of those turns again. In general, for main deck, I prefer Perch Grapplers, given that particularly in Voltaire builds, and even in Death Dealer lightning-based builds, you've got a lot of natural go again from your cards or from your bow, and you don't necessarily need the Scalers as much, but there are some builds that might prefer Scalers over Perch Grapplers. I can certainly see that. So in summary, we've got through quite a bit there in terms of Lexi theory. So craft your game plan around your chosen element. So choose Ice or Lightning. You can play a few cards from both card pools. There's no harm in doing that. Like if you're an Ice-based deck, like you've got more Ice Fusion arrows, doesn't mean you can't play any Lightning cards. Like still play Ball Lightning, still play Lightning Press if you want, if they're good cards in your deck. But I think what I mean here is think about what you're going to be getting out of your fusing cards, your cards that actually have fusion. So your arrows, like what's your arrow pool that you're playing? I think if you play too many lightning and ice fusion arrows, then you risk missing too much. So I wouldn't recommend that approach. So I guess if you're playing the ice fusion arrows, focus on that. Make sure you got enough ice cards. And then if lightning cards make the cut, they make the cut. But focus on the disruption on your turn that you can get from the Cold Wave and the Frostlock, and the disruption on their turn that you can get from the Chilling Icevein and the Blizzard Bolt, and craft your game plan around that. Likewise, if you're playing Lightning, craft your game plan around landing your lighted ups and landing your Frazzles and landing your Buzz Bolts and getting those really big turns where the damage is getting amplified. And if you want some ice cards in there, some Winter's Bites as a bit of extra disruption or whatever else, go for it. No harm in doing that. But I think trying to fuse both ice and lightning arrows in the same deck is a little bit fraught with danger and inconsistency. Threaten on hit triggers to force blocks. I think this is more powerful. As I mentioned, you can go for the Snapshot and the Dazzling Crescendo and the low to the ground resource efficient decks, but I think where Lexi really shines is the on hit triggers from a lot of the one cost arrows. So the Frazzles, the Buzz Bolts, Frostlock, Chilling Icevein, and the Blizzard Bolt. Those are the on-hit triggers, as well as some of the neutral ones like Remorseless and Hamstring Shot that you can use to try and force them to block. Play to your 6-card hands if you're playing a Voltaire build. Don't be afraid to, block with 3 cards, Arsenal 1 on the following turn, flip it face up, maybe get a benefit, maybe don't. Block with 3 cards, Arsenal another one. And then take some damage the next turn and have a 6-card hand. Don't be afraid to do that, because that 6-card hand ability that New Horizon gives you is really powerful, and it's worth playing into that sometimes. Likewise, if you've got Snapshot combos in your deck, play to those and use those turns to try and land damage and try and land a bit of chip damage here and there as well. Build to maximize your 3 of a kind turns. So when you're building your deck, think about how consistently am I going to be able to get the most out of these 3 of a kind turns, or these big snapshot turns, or these 6-card hands, and just really think about what's the ceiling that you're trying to create, and how often are you going to be able to get close to it. If you're not trying to play to a really high ceiling, make sure that your floor is reasonably high and that you're consistently outputting a lot of damage and a lot of disruption. But I think you can do both. I think you can have a pretty high floor and a pretty consistent deck with Lexi. You can threaten a lot of on-hit triggers, and you can still have the capacity to have these amazing turns as well. So that's my advice. That's my take on Lexi. Hope you all enjoy crafting the many different builds that there are out there, testing them all out, and that you find some success with it. All the best, and we'll see you with another hero spotlight very soon. Cheers.